Essential question 3 is what were the achievements and failures of Jefferson's presidency? Again, Jefferson's presidency or his election in 1800 should really serve as the beginning of period 4. So this question and the rest of the questions for this chapter are really dealing with things from period 4, which starts in 1800. Nonetheless, the Revolution of 1800 gives Thomas Jefferson the presidency and Democratic Republicans majorities in government. And when in government, the Democratic Republicans are going to work to reduce the size and authority of the national government because they believed in a small government that was not interfering in the lives of average Americans very much. And to that end, Democratic Republicans reduced the number of federal employees. They reduced the size of the Army and the Navy, and they even eliminated all taxes except for the tariff, or the tax on imported goods. And eliminating these taxes included eliminating the tax on whiskey that had been part of Hamilton's financial plan. However, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans' efforts to reduce the size and authority of the government met with some resistance from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, under its Chief Justice John Marshall, believed in a strong national government, and they made decisions to strengthen the government. There are many decisions that do this, but the big one is Marbury v. Madison. Marbury v. Madison established the principle of judicial review, which means that the Marshall Court's ruling here allowed for something called judicial review. And judicial review is the power of the courts to declare an action of Congress or the president unconstitutional, thus rendering it invalid. And this is important because it makes the Supreme Court co-equal in power to the presidency or to Congress. And it's going to mean a powerful federal government that can invalidate laws and things like this. Also, the Democratic Republicans' efforts to reduce the size and authority of government is actually going to meet from resistance from actually Jefferson himself. And he does this with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which violates Jefferson's sense of small, not very powerful government, and very much violates his ideas of strict constructionalism because the Constitution does not allow the president to purchase territory in this way. The Louisiana Purchase really begins with the Port of New Orleans. And back in 1795, the U.S. had concluded something called Pinckney's Treaty with France. And Pinckney's Treaty allowed for Western farmers to trade through the French port of New Orleans. But during Jefferson's presidency, he sends envoys to New Orleans to offer to purchase the city, and to their surprise, they find that they are actually offered all of the Louisiana territory seen here on the map. That is because Napoleon, the Emperor of France at this time, is in need of quick revenue, and he hopes to sell off the Louisiana Purchase in order to fund his wars in Europe. And the U.S. is going to purchase the Louisiana territory at what is actually a bargain price of $15 million, and it will double the size of the United States overnight. And the reason Jefferson goes back on his idea of strict constructionalism to make this purchase, even when the Constitution doesn't really allow him to, is because Jefferson hoped to promote something that he envisioned called an agrarian republic. And this was his vision of an egalitarian agricultural society that was focused on local governance rather than large governance by a national government. Because Jefferson really believed that the yeoman farmer, or the small independent farmer, best exemplified virtue and independence in the American Republic. So his purchase of the Louisiana Territory was to try to promote this agrarian republic idea. But after we purchase the Louisiana Territory for $15 million, Jefferson is going to dispatch Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery to explore and map the region and get it ready for settlement. Now, if the Louisiana Purchase was a major accomplishment of the Jefferson presidency, a major failure of the Jefferson presidency is the Embargo Act of 1807. And the Embargo Act of 1807 was a failure because it literally devastates the American economy. So war had resumed between Britain and France, who were once again blockading one another and stopping American ships from trading. And the Embargo Act was an effort to end violations of neutral U.S. trade. In particular, it was hoping to end the practice of impressment, where the British were capturing American sailors and forcing them to work on British naval vessels. And the way we were going to do this was to simply boycott British goods. This had worked during the Revolution, but it doesn't work now. And this boycott of British goods or British imports into the United States devastates the American economy. It doesn't stop the practice of impressment, and it is very strongly opposed by New England merchants who are, of course, losing a lot of money here. This conflict between the French and the British, and thus the Americans and the British, due to the practice of impressment, among other things, is going to continue to be a problem for the next U.S. President, James Madison, who is going to face these same problems and also face calls for war with Britain from so-called war hawks who lived in the West. These war hawks are people that wanted war with Britain. They wanted war with Britain to first uphold the principle of free trade against that British practice of impressment. And secondly, they wanted war with Britain in order to be able to annex Canada and to annex Florida, both of which often served as refuges for runaway slaves. And we're kind of familiar with that idea for Canada, but in particular Florida, if you think back to the Stono Rebellion during the colonial period, where slaves in South Carolina rebelled and they tried to flee to Spanish Florida for their freedom there. Of course, they were unsuccessful. Nonetheless, Madison is facing calls for war with Britain as our tensions with them mount, particularly over the practice of impressment, from war hawks, and war hawks want to end the practice of impressment, and they want to annex Canada and Florida. And these calls for war from the war hawks are going to only increase the chance for war with Britain, leading ultimately to the War of 1812.